In the winter of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée marched into Russia with 600,000 soldiers and came back with fewer than 100,000. Historians have spent 2 centuries explaining that catastrophe: the Russian winter, the scorched earth strategy, the impossibly extended supply lines, the tactical genius of refusing to engage a retreating enemy until starvation and cold did the work instead. All of those explanations are correct. But there is one explanation that almost never appears in the history books, one that a military historian would find almost too embarrassing to write down. The buttons on the French uniforms were made of tin, and tin, at sustained temperatures below -13 degrees Celsius, undergoes a structural transformation that material scientists call tin pest, a process in which the metal loses its molecular cohesion and crumbles into a gray powder. The French soldiers' buttons disintegrated in the Russian winter. Their coats fell open. Their uniforms lost their ability to seal against the wind. Men who might have survived on body heat alone, men who had marched 1,000 miles and were still capable of fighting, died not from enemy action, not from starvation, not from disease, but from cold that entered through the gaps where their buttons used to be. 600,000 soldiers. And the button, a fastener so small and so ordinary that you have never once thought about it, may have determined how many of them came home. But the story of the button does not begin with catastrophe. It begins, as so many things do, with vanity. To understand what the button became, you have to understand what clothing was before it existed. And what clothing was, for the vast majority of human history, was a problem that nobody had fully solved. Humans have been wearing some form of clothing for at least 100,000 years, possibly longer. The evidence for this does not come from the clothing itself, which decays, but from the body lice. Human body lice, which differ genetically from head lice precisely because they evolved to live in clothing rather than hair, diverged from head lice approximately 170,000 years ago, which means humans were wearing enough clothing, consistently enough, for a new species of parasite to evolve specifically to exploit it. We have been dressing ourselves for 170,000 years. For most of that time, the technology for keeping clothing on the body was, by any modern standard, deeply inadequate. Hides were tied with sinew or leather cord. Later garments were pinned with thorns, then with carved bone pins, then with bronze fibulae, the ancient world's version of a safety pin, a sprung metal clasp that held fabric together through tension alone. The toga, the chiton, the tunic, the defining garments of the greatest civilizations in the ancient world, were all essentially draped fabric held in place by gravity, pins, or knots. None of them fastened. None of them sealed. None of them could be adjusted at the wrist, the collar, the chest, the precise points where cold enters a garment and body heat escapes. The civilizations that built the Parthenon and the Colosseum and the aqueducts of Rome, civilizations capable of extraordinary feats of engineering across nearly every domain of human activity, walked around in clothing that fundamentally could not keep them warm in a serious winter. They were, in the most literal sense, one fastening technology away from a warmer world. That technology was not going to come from Greece. It was not going to come from Rome. It was going to come from the steppes of Central Asia. And it was going to arrive in Europe the way almost every transformative technology of the medieval period arrived, through war. The button, a disc or sphere with holes or a shank, passed through a loop or slit in fabric to hold 2 pieces together, appears in the archaeological record of the Indus Valley civilization as early as 2000 BC. But those early buttons were not fasteners. They were ornaments. Decorative shells and carved stones attached to garments for display, status signals, aesthetic choices, objects that communicated wealth and taste in a world where the materials and craftsmanship to produce them were expensive and rare. The conceptual leap from button as ornament to button as fastener is one of the most consequential design insights in human history. And it happened, as best as historians can reconstruct, somewhere in the Germanic and Central Asian world in the early 13th century. The mechanism is simple to the point of embarrassment when you see it written down. Cut a slit in one piece of fabric. Attach a disc to the other. Pass the disc through the slit. The 2 pieces of fabric are now held together at a specific point, under tension, in a way that can be released and re-engaged instantly, repeatedly, without damaging the fabric. That is the entire invention. And yet no civilization in 5,000 years of recorded history had combined those two elements, the disc and the slit, into a functioning fastener until the 13th century. The reason matters, and the reason is this. It requires a specific level of textile sophistication, specifically woven fabric with enough structural integrity to hold a sewn buttonhole without tearing under tension, to make the button functional rather than decorative. The ancient world had the disc. It did not have the fabric. The 13th century had both, and the moment those two technologies met, the button spread across Europe with a speed that suggests the rest of the continent had been waiting for it without knowing what it was waiting for. Within 100 years of the button's adoption as a fastener, European clothing had been transformed more completely than in the previous millennium. The century between 1200 and 1300 is, in the history of fashion, one of the most dramatic periods of change ever recorded. Before the button, European clothing was largely shapeless, draped, belted, pinned. The human body beneath it was implied rather than expressed. The silhouette of a dressed person in 1150 was essentially a column of fabric with a head on top. After the button, everything changed. Buttons allowed garments to be fitted, cut to follow the contours of the body, and fastened precisely along seams and openings. The sleeve, previously a tube of fabric tied or pinned at the wrist, could now be tailored to the arm and fastened with a row of buttons from elbow to wrist that sealed the garment against cold with a precision that no pin or knot could achieve. The collar could be closed. The chest could be layered. Garments could be designed to open and close, to add and remove, to create insulation systems of a sophistication that the ancient world, for all its achievements, had never had access to. The human body, for the first time in the history of clothing, was warm in a deliberate, engineered, adjustable way. And the consequences of that warmth rippled outward in ways that historians have only recently begun to map with any precision. Populations in Northern Europe, where winters were severe enough to constitute a genuine annual mortality event, where the very young and very old died in measurable numbers every cold season, began surviving winters at higher rates. Workers who could remain functional in cold weather extended the agricultural and construction seasons. Armies could campaign in cold weather in ways that would have been catastrophically costly a century before. The button did not end winter, but it changed what winter could do to a human being. And then, as with every object in this series that offered genuine power over the human condition, someone decided the button was too important to leave to function alone. They made it a weapon. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the button underwent a transformation that should, by now, feel familiar. It became a status signal so extreme that it nearly broke the economies of the people using it. The courts of Europe, France, Spain, England, the Habsburg Empire, entered a button arms race that consumed quantities of gold, silver, and precious stones that make modern luxury fashion look restrained. Francis I of France, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, reportedly had a single black velvet suit decorated with 13,600 gold buttons. 13,600 on one suit. His courtiers competed to match him. Tailors became some of the most economically significant craftsmen in Europe. The demand for buttons, increasingly ornate, increasingly expensive, increasingly divorced from any functional purpose, drove entire manufacturing industries in Paris, Lyon, and London. Sumptuary laws, legislation regulating what different social classes were permitted to wear, were updated repeatedly across European nations, specifically to restrict who was allowed to wear gold and silver buttons. Because without legal restriction, the merchant class was spending itself into ruin, trying to signal the same status as the nobility through buttonage alone. Buttonage, a legal and commercial category significant enough to require its own laws. In 1620, the Button Makers Guild of Paris, whose members produced the functional cloth-covered buttons worn by the non-aristocratic population, petitioned the French crown for legal protection against the tailors, who had begun producing their own buttons as part of the garment-making process. The resulting legal battle between the Button Makers Guild and the Tailors Guild lasted for decades and produced more than 200 legal documents. 200 legal documents about buttons. This is what happens when a functional object becomes a social currency. The same object that was crumbling off French soldiers' uniforms in the Russian winter of 1812 had 2 centuries earlier been the subject of guild wars, sumptuary legislation, and royal fashion competition at a scale that consumed the political attention of multiple European governments. The button was not just a fastener, it was power, compressed into a disc, sewn onto fabric, worn on the body for everyone to read.